Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Last we left off, our intrepid adventurers had reached the America, and they were on their way across the Transcontinental Railroad, as I recall. So let's get right back into it with chapter 27, in which Passepartout undergoes, at a speed of 20 miles an hour, a course of Mormon history. During the night of the 5th of December, the train ran southeasterly for about 50 miles, and then rose an equal distance in the northeasterly direction toward the Great Salt Lake. Passepartout, about 9 o'clock, went out upon the platform to take the air. The weather was cold, the heavens gray, but it wasn't snowing. The sun's disk, enlarged by the mist, seemed an enormous ring of gold, and Passepartout was amusing himself by calculating its value in pounds sterling, when he was diverted from this interesting study by a strange-looking personage who made his appearance on the platform. This personage, who had taken the train at Elko, was tall and black, with a black mustache, black stockings, a black silk hat, a black waistcoat, black trousers, a white cravat, and dogskin gloves. He might have been taken for a clergyman. He went from one end of the train to another, and affixed to the door of each car a notice written in manuscript. Passepartout approached and read one of these notices, which stated that Elder William Hitch, Mormon missionary, taking advantage of his presence on train number 48, would deliver a lecture on Mormonism in car 117 from 11 to 12 o'clock, and that he invited all those who were desirous of being instructed concerning the mysteries of the religion of the Latter-day Saints to attend. The news quickly spread through the train, which contained about 100 passengers, 30 of whom, at most, attracted by the notice, ensconced themselves in car number 117. Passepartout took one of the front seats, and neither Mr. Fogg nor Fix cared to attend. At the appointed hour, William Hitch rose, and in an irritated voice, as if he'd already been contradicted, said, "I tell you that Joe Smith is a martyr, that his brother Hiram is a martyr, that the persecutions of the United States government against the prophets will also make a martyr of Brigham Young. Who dares to say the contrary?" No one ventured to gainsay the missionary, whose excited tone contrasted curiously with his naturally calm visage. No doubt his anger arose from the hardships to which the Mormons were actually subjected. The government had just succeeded, with some difficulty, in reducing these independent fanatics to its rule. It had made itself the master of Utah, and subjected that territory to the laws of the Union, after imprisoning Brigham Young on the charge of rebellion and polygamy. The disciples of the prophet had since redoubled their efforts, and resisted, by the words at least, the authority of Congress. Elder Hitch, as was seen, was trying to make proselytes on the very railway trains. Then, emphasizing his words with his loud voice and frequent gestures, he related the history of the Mormons from biblical times, how that in Israel a Mormon prophet of the tribe of Joseph published the annals of the new religion, and bequeathed them to his son Mormon, how many centuries later a translation of this precious book, which was written in Egyptian, was made by Joseph Smith, Jr., a Vermont farmer, who revealed himself as a mystical prophet in 1825, and how, in short, the celestial messenger appeared to him in an illuminated forest and gave him the annals of the Lord. Several of the audience, not being much interested in the missionary's narrative, here left the car. But Elder Hitch, continuing his lecture, related how Smith, Jr., with his father, 2 brothers, and a few disciples, founded the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which adopted not only in America, but in England, Norway, and Sweden, and Germany, counts many artisans, as well as men engaged in the liberal professions, among its members; how a colony was established in Ohio, a temple erected there at a cost of $200,000, and a town built at Kirkland; how Smith became an enterprising banker, and received from a simple mummy showman a papyrus scroll written by Abraham and several famous Egyptians. The elder's story became somewhat wearisome, and his audience grew gradually less, until it was reduced to 20 passengers. This did not disconcert the enthusiast, who proceeded with the story of Joseph Smith's bankruptcy in 1837, and how his ruined creditors gave him a coat of tar and feathers. His reappearance some years afterwards, and more honorable and honored than ever, at Independence, Missouri, the chief of a flourishing colony of 3,000 disciples, and his pursuit thence by outraged Gentiles, and retirement into the far West. 10 hearers were now only left, among them honest Passepartout, who was listening with all his ears. Thus he learned that after long persecution Smith reappeared in Illinois, and in 1839 founded a community at Nauvoo, on the Mississippi, numbering 25,000 souls, of which he became mayor, chief justice, and general-in-chief. That he announced himself in 1843 as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and that finally, being drawn into ambuscade at Carthage, was thrown into prison and assassinated by a band of men disguised in masks. Passepartout was now the only person left in the car, and the elder, looking him full in the face, reminded him that 2 years after the assassination of Joseph Smith, the inspired prophet Brigham Young, his successor, left Nauvoo for the banks of the Great Salt Lake, where, in that midst of the fertile region, directly on the route of the immigrants who crossed Utah on their way to California, the new colony, thanks to the polygamy practiced by the Mormons, had flourished beyond expectations. And this is why we have the jealousy of Congress aroused against us. Why have the soldiers of the Union invaded the soil of Utah? Why has Brigham Young, our chief, been imprisoned and in the contempt of all justice? Shall we yield to force? Never. Driven from Vermont, driven from Illinois, driven from Ohio, driven from Missouri, driven from Utah, we shall yet find some independent territory on which to plant our tents. And you, my brother, continued the elder, fixing his angry eyes upon his single auditor, will you not plant yours there too, under the shadow of our flag? No, replied Passepartout courageously, in his turn retiring from the car, and leaving the elder to preach to vacancy. During the lecture the train had been making good progress, and towards 12:30 it reached the northwest border of the Great Salt Lake. Thence the passengers could observe the vast extent of this interior sea, which is also called the Dead Sea, and into which flows an American Jordan. It's a picturesque expanse, framed in lofty crags and large strata, encrusted with white salt. A superb sheet of water, which was formerly of larger extent than now, its shores having encroached with the lapse of time, and thus at once reduced its breadth and increased its depth. The Salt Lake, 70 miles long and 35 wide, is situated 3 miles 800 feet above the sea. Quite different from Lake Asphalite, whose depression is 1,200 feet below the sea. It contains considerable salt, and 1/4 of the weight of the water is solid matter, its specific weight being 1,170, and after being distilled 1,000. Fish are, of course, unable to live in it, and those which descend through the Jordan, Weber, and other streams soon perish. The country around the lake was well cultivated, for the Mormons were mostly farmers, while ranches and pens for domesticated animals, fields of wheat, corn, and other cereals, luxuriant prairies, hedges of wild rose, clumps of acacias in the milkwort would have been seen 6 months later. Now the ground was just covered with a thin powdering of snow. The train reached Ogden at 2 o'clock, where it rested for 6 hours. Mr. Fogg and his party had time to pay a visit to Salt Lake City, connected with Ogden by a branch road, and they spent 2 hours in this strikingly American town, built on the pattern of the other cities of the Union, like a checkerboard with the somber sadness of right angles, as Hugo expressed it. The founder of the City of the Saints could not escape from the taste for symmetry which distinguishes the Anglo-Saxons. In this strange country, where the people are certainly not up to the level of their institutions, everything's done squarely. Cities, houses, and follies. The travelers, then, were promenading, at 3 o'clock, about the streets of the town, built between the banks of the Jordan and the spurs of that Wasatch Ridge. They saw few or no churches, but the prophet's mansion, the courthouse, and the arsenal, blue brick houses with verandas and porches, surrounded by gardens, bordered with acacias, palms, and locusts. A clay and pebble wall, built in 1853, surrounded the town, and the principal street were the market and several hotels adorned with pavilions. The place didn't seem thickly populated. The streets were almost deserted, except in the vicinity of the temple, which they only reached after having traversed several quarters surrounded by palisades. There were many women, which was easily accounted for by the peculiar institution of the Mormons, but it must not be supposed that all the Mormons are polygamists. They're free to marry or not, as they please, but it's worth noting that it's mainly the female citizens of Utah who are anxious to marry, as according to the Mormon religion, maiden ladies are not admitted to the possession of its highest joys. Those poor creatures seem to be neither well off nor happy. Some, the more well-to-do no doubt, wore short, open black silk dresses, under a hood or a modest shawl, and others were habited in native American fashion. Passepartout couldn't behold without a certain fright these women charged in groups with conferring happiness on a single Mormon. His common sense pitied above all the husband. It seemed to him a terrible thing to have to guide so many wives at once across the vicissitudes of life, and to conduct them, as it were, in a body to the Mormon paradise, with the prospect of seeing them in the company of the glorious Smith, who doubtless was the chief ornament of that delightful place to all eternity. He felt decidedly repelled from such a vocation, and he imagined, though perhaps he was mistaken, that the fair ones of Salt Lake City cast rather alarming glances on his person. Happily his stay there was but brief, and at 4 the party found themselves again at the station, took their places in the train, and the whistle sounded for starting. Just at the moment, however, that the locomotive wheels began to move, cries of "Stop! Stop!" were heard. Trains, like time and tide, stopped for no one. The gentleman who uttered the cries was evidently a belated Mormon. He was breathless with running. Happily for him, the station had neither gates nor barriers, so he rushed along the track, jumped on the rear platform of the train, and fell, exhausted, into one of the seats. Passepartout, who had been anxiously watching this amateur gymnast, approached him with lively interest, and learned that he had taken flight after an unpleasant domestic scene. When the Mormon had recovered his breath, Passepartout ventured to ask him politely how many wives he had, for from the manner in which he decamped, it might be thought he had 20 at least. "One, sir," replied the Mormon, raising his arms heavenward. "One, and that was enough." Alright, let's get into chapter 25, 6, 7, 8, 28, in which Passepartout does not succeed in making anybody listen to reason. The train, on leaving Great Salt Lake at Ogden, passed northward for an hour as far as Weber River, having completed nearly 900 miles from San Francisco. From this point it took an easterly direction toward the jagged Wasatch Mountains. It was in the section that included between this range and the Rocky Mountains that the American engineers found the most formidable difficulties in laying the road, and that the government granted a subsidy of $48,000 per mile instead of $16,000 allowed for the work done on the plains. But the engineers, instead of violating nature, avoided its difficulties by winding around instead of penetrating the rocks. One tunnel only, 14,000 feet in length, was pierced in order to arrive at the Great Basin. The track up to this time had reached its highest elevation at the Great Salt Lake. From this point it described a long curve, descending towards Bitter Creek Valley, to rise again to the dividing ridge of waters between the Atlantic and the Pacific. There were many creeks in this mountainous region, and it was necessary to cross Muddy Creek, Green Creek, and others upon culverts. Passepartout grew more and more impatient as they went on, while Fix longed to get out of this difficult region, and was more anxious than Phileas Fogg himself to be beyond the danger of delays and accidents, and set foot on English soil. At 10 o'clock at night the train stopped at Fort Bridger Station, and 20 minutes later entered Wyoming territory, following the valley of Bitter Creek throughout. The next day, on the 7th of December, they stopped for a quarter of an hour at a Green River station. Snow had fallen abundantly during the night, but being mixed with rain it had half melted, and didn't interrupt their progress. The bad weather, however, annoyed Passepartout, for the accumulation of snow by blocking the wheels of the cars would certainly have been fatal to Mr. Fogg's tour. What an idea! Wait, this is Passport out. Oh, what an idea! Why did my master make this journey in winter? Couldn't he have waited for the good season to increase his chances? While the worthy Frenchman was absorbed in the state of the sky and the depression of the temperature, Auda was experiencing fears from a totally different cause. Several passengers had gotten off at Green River and were walking up and down the platforms, and among these Auda recognized Colonel Stamp Proctor, the same who had so grossly insulted Phileas Fogg at the San Francisco meeting. Not wishing to be recognized, the young woman drew back from the window, feeling much alarm at her discovery. She was attached to the man who, however coldly, gave her daily evidences of the most absolute devotion. She didn't comprehend, perhaps, the depth of the sentiment with which her protector inspired her, which she called gratitude, but which, though she was unconscious of it, was really more than that. Her heart sank within her when she recognized the man whom Mr. Fogg desired, sooner or later, to call to account for his conduct. Chance alone, it was clear, had brought Colonel Proctor on this train, but there he was, and it was necessary, at all hazards, that Phileas Fogg should not perceive his adversary. Auda seized the moment when Mr. Fogg was asleep to tell Fix and Passepartout whom she'd seen. "That Proctor on this train? Well, reassure yourself, madam. Before he settles with Mr. Fogg, he's got to deal with me. Seems to me I was the more insulted of the two. And besides, I'll take care of him, Colonel, as he is." "Mr. Fix, Mr. Fogg will allow no one to avenge him. He said he would come back to America to find this man. Should he perceive Colonel Proctor, we couldn't prevent a collision which might have terrible results. He must not see him." "You're right, madam. A meeting between them might ruin us all. Whether we were victorious or beaten, Mr. Fogg would be delayed, and that would play the game of the gentlemen of the Reform Club. In 4 days we shall be in New York. Well, if my master does not leave his car during those 4 days, we may hope that his chance might not bring him face to face with this confounded American. We must, if possible, prevent his stirring out of it." At this the conversation dropped. Mr. Fogg had just woken up, and was looking out of his window. Soon after, Passepartout, without being heard by his master or Auda, whispered to the detective, "Would you really fight for him?" "I'd do anything," replied Fix in a tone which betrayed determined will, "to get him living back to Europe." Was there any means of detaining Mr. Fogg in the car to avoid a meeting between him and the Colonel? It ought not to be a difficult task, since the gentleman was naturally sedentary and a little curious. The detective at least seemed to have found a way, for after a few moments he said to Mr. Fogg, "These are long and slow hours, sir, that we're passing on the railway." "Yes, but they pass." "You were in the habit of playing whist on the steamers." "Yes, but it would be difficult to do so here. I have neither cards nor partners." "Oh, we could easily buy some cards. They sell them on all the American trains. As for partners, if Madame plays—" "Oh, certainly, sir. I understand whist. It's a part of an English education." "I myself have some pretensions to playing a good game. Well, here are 3 of us and a dummy." "As you please, sir," replied Phileas Fogg, heartily glad to resume his favourite pastime, even on the railway. Passepartout was dispatched in search of the steward, and soon returned with 2 packs of cards, some pins, counters, and a shelf covered with cloth. The game commenced. Auda understood whist sufficiently well, and even received some compliments on her playing from Mr. Fogg. As for the detective, he was simply an adept, and worthy of being matched against his present opponent. "Now we've got him. He won't budge," thought Passepartout. At 11 in the morning, the train had reached the dividing ridge of the waters at Bridger Pass, 7,524 feet above the level of the sea, one of the highest points attained by track in crossing the Rocky Mountains. After going about 200 miles, the travelers at last found themselves on one of those vast plains which extend to the Atlantic, and in which nature is made so propitious for laying the iron road. On the declivity of the Atlantic basin, the first streams, branches of the North Platte River, had already appeared. The whole northern and eastern horizon was bounded by the immense semicircular curtain which is formed by the southern portion of the Rocky Mountains, the highest being Laramie Peak. Between this and the railway extended vast plains, plentifully irrigated. On the right rose the lower spurs of the mountainous oh, sorry about that. Where was I? On the right rose the lower spurs of the mountainous mass which extends southward to the sources of the Arkansas River, one of the great tributaries of the Missouri. At 12:30 the travelers caught sight for an instant of Fort Halleck, which commands that section, and in a few more hours the Rocky Mountains were crossed. There was reason to hope, then, that no accident would mark the journey through this difficult country. The snow had ceased falling, and the air became crisp and cold. Large birds, frightened by the locomotive, rose and flew off into the distance. No wild beast appeared on the plain. It was a desert in its vast nakedness. After a comfortable breakfast served in the car, Mr. Fogg and his partners had just resumed whist when a violent whistling was heard, and the train stopped. Passepartout put his head out of the door, but he saw nothing to cause delay. No station was in view. Ouda and Fix feared that Mr. Fogg might take it into his head to get out, but that gentleman contented himself with saying to his servant, "See what's the matter." Passepartout rushed out of the car, and 30 or 40 passengers had already descended, amongst them Colonel Stamp Proctor. The train had stopped before a red signal which blocked the way. The engineer and conductor were talking excitedly with a signalman whom the station master at Medicine Bow, the next stopping place, had sent on before. The passengers drew around and took part in the discussion, in which Colonel Proctor, with his insolent manners, was conspicuous. Passepartout, joining the group, heard the signalman say, "No, you can't pass. The bridge at Medicine Bow is shaky, and it wouldn't bear the weight of the train." This was a suspension bridge thrown over some rapids, about a mile from the place where they now were. According to the signalman, it was in ruinous condition, several of the iron wires being broken, and it was impossible to risk the passage. He didn't in any way exaggerate the condition of the bridge. It may be taken for granted that, rash as the Americans usually are, when they're prudent, there's good reason for it. Passepartout, not daring to apprise his master of what he heard, listened with set teeth, immovable as a statue. Cried Colonel Proctor. "But we're not going to stay here, I imagine, and take root in the snow." "Colonel, we've telegraphed to Omaha for a train, but it's not likely that it'll reach Medicine Bow in less than 6 hours." 6 hours? Certainly. Besides, it'll take us as long as that to reach Medicine Bow on foot. "But it's only a mile from here." "Yes, but it's on the other side of the river." "And we can't cross that in a boat." "It's impossible. The creek's swelled by the rains. It's a rapid. We'll have to make a circuit of 10 miles to the north and find a ford." The colonel launched a volley of oaths, denouncing the railway company and the conductor, and Passepartout, who was furious, was not disinclined to make common cause with him. Here was an obstacle indeed which all his master's banknotes could not remove. There was a general disappointment among the passengers, who, without reckoning the delay, saw themselves compelled to trudge 15 miles over a plain covered with snow. They grumbled and protested, and would certainly have thus attracted Phileas Fogg's attention if he had not been completely absorbed in his game. Passepartout found that he couldn't avoid telling his master what had occurred, and with hanging head he was turning toward the car when the engineer, a true Yankee, named Forster, called out, "Gentlemen, perhaps there's a way after all to get over." "On the bridge?" "On the bridge." "With our train?" "With our train." Passepartout stopped short and eagerly listened to the engineer. "But the bridge is unsafe." "No matter. I think by putting on the very highest speed we got a chance of getting over." "Oh, the devil!" muttered Passepartout. But a number of the passengers were at once attracted by the engineer's proposal, and Colonel Proctor was especially delighted and found the plan a very feasible one. He told stories about engineers leaping their trains over rivers without bridges by putting on full steam, and many of those present avowed themselves in the engineer's mind. "We have 50 chances of getting over," said one. "80, 90. Passepartout was astounded, and though ready to attempt anything to get over Medicine Creek, thought the experiment proposed a little too American. "Besides, there's still a more simple way. It doesn't even occur to any of these people." "Sir," he said aloud to one of the passengers, "the engineer's plan seems to me a little dangerous, but—" "80 chances," replied the passenger, turning his back on him. "I know it, but a simple idea—" "Ideas are no use," returned the American, shrugging his shoulders. "The engineer assures us we can pass." "Doubtless we can pass, but perhaps it would be more prudent—" "What? Prudent?" cried Colonel Proctor, whom this word seemed to excite prodigiously. "At full speed, don't you see? At full speed." "I know, I see, but it would be, if not more prudent, since that word displeases you, at least more natural." "What? What's the matter with this fellow?" cried several, and the poor fellow didn't know whom to address himself. "Are you afraid?" "I afraid? Very well, I'll show these people that a Frenchman can be as American as they." "All aboard!" cried the conductor. "Yes, all aboard," repeated Passepartout, and immediately did so. "But they can't prevent me from thinking it'd be more natural for us to cross the bridge on foot and let the train come after." But no one heard this sage reflection, nor anyone would have acknowledged its justice. The passengers resumed their places in the cars, and Passepartout took his seat, without telling what had passed. The whist players were quite absorbed in their game. The locomotive whistled vigorously, and the engineer, reversing the steam, backed the train for nearly a mile, retiring like a jumper, in order to take a longer leap. And then with another whistle he began to move forward, the train increasing its speed, and soon its rapidity became frightful. A prolonged screech issued from the locomotive. The piston worked up and down 20 strokes to the second. They perceived that the whole train, rushing on at the rate of 100 miles an hour, hardly bore upon the rails at all. And they passed over. It was like a flash. No one saw the bridge. The train leaped, so to speak, from one bank to the other, and the engineer couldn't stop it until he'd gone 5 miles beyond the station. But scarcely had the train passed the river when the bridge, completely ruined, fell with a crash into the rapids of Medicine Bow. Chapter 29, in which certain incidents are narrated which are only to be met with on American railroads. The train pursued its course that evening without interruption, passing Fort Saunders, crossing Cheyenne Pass, and reaching Evans Pass. The road here attained the highest elevation of the journey, 8,092 feet above the level of the sea. The travelers had now only to descend through the Atlantic by limitless plains leveled by nature. A branch of the Grand Trunk led off southward to Denver, the capital of Colorado. The country round about is rich in gold and silver, and more than 50,000 inhabitants are already settled there. 1,382 miles had passed over from San Francisco in 3 days and 3 nights. 4 nights and days more would probably bring them to New York. Fogg was not yet behindhand. During the night, Camp Walbach was passed on the left. Lodgepole Creek ran parallel with the road, marking the boundary between the territories of Wyoming and Colorado. They entered Nebraska at 11, passed near Sedgwick, and touched at Julesburg, on the southern branch of the Platte River. It was here that the Union Pacific Railroad was inaugurated on the 23rd of October, 1867, by the chief engineer, General Dodge. 2 powerful locomotives, carrying 9 cars of invited guests, amongst whom was Thomas C. Durant, vice president of the road, stopped at this point. Cheers were given, the Sioux and Pawnee performed an imitation Indian battle, fireworks were let off, and the first number of the Railway Pioneer was printed by a press brought on the train. Thus was celebrated the inauguration of this great railroad, a mighty instrument of progress and civilization thrown across the desert and destined to link together cities and towns which didn't yet exist. The whistle of the locomotive, more powerful than Amphion's lyre, was about to bid them rise from American soil. Fort McPherson was left behind at 8 in the morning, and 357 miles had yet to be traversed before reaching Omaha. The road followed the capricious windings of the southern branch of the Platte River on its left bank. At 9, the train stopped at the important town of North Platte, built between two arms of the river, which rejoin each other around it and form a single artery, a large tributary whose waters empty into the Missouri a little above Omaha. That 101st meridian was passed. Mr. Fogg and his partners resumed their game, and no one, not even the dummy, complained of the length of the trip. Fix had begun by winning several guineas which he seemed likely to lose, but he showed himself a not less eager whist player than Mr. Fogg. During the morning, chance distinctly favored that gentleman. Trumps and honors were showered upon his hands. Once, having resolved on a bold stroke, he was on the point of playing a spade when a voice behind him said, "I should play a diamond." Mr. Fogg, Ouda, and Fix raised their heads and beheld Colonel Proctor. Stamp Proctor and Phileas Fogg recognized each other at once.
"Oh, it's you, is it, Englishman? It's you who are going to play a spade?"
"And who plays it?" replied Phileas Fogg coolly, throwing down the 10 of spades.
"Well, it pleases me to have it diamonds,"
replied Colonel Proctor in an insolent tone. He made a movement as if to seize the card which had just been played, adding,
"You don't understand anything about whist."
"Perhaps I do as well as another," replied Phileas Fogg, rising.
"You only have to try," said a John Bull.
Ouda turned pale and her blood ran cold. She seized Mr. Fogg's arm and gently pulled him back. Passepartout was ready to pounce upon the American, who was staring insolently at his opponent, but Fix got up and going to Colonel Proctor said,
"You forget it is I with whom you have to deal, sir, for it was me whom you not only insulted but struck."
"Mr. Fix, pardon me, but this affair is mine, and mine only. The Colonel has again insulted me by insisting that I should not play a spade, and he shall give me satisfaction for it."
"Where and when you will, and with whatever weapon you choose,"
replied the American. Ouda, in vain, attempted to retain Mr. Fogg, as vainly did the detective endeavor to make the quarrel his. Passepartout wished to throw the Colonel out of the window, but a sign from his master checked him. Phileas Fogg left the car, and the American followed him upon the platform. "Sir," said Mr. Fogg to his adversary, "I am in a great hurry to get back to Europe, and any delay whatsoever will be greatly to my disadvantage."
"Well, what's that to me?"
"So," said Mr. Fogg very politely, "after our meeting at San Francisco, I had determined to return to America and find you as soon as I had completed the business which called me to England."
"Really?"
"Will you appoint a meeting for 6 months hence?"
"Why not 10 years hence?"
"I say 6 months, and I shall be at the place of meeting promptly."
"Oh, this is an evasion, now or never."
"Very good. You going to New York?"
"No."
"To Chicago?"
"No."
"To Omaha?"
"What difference is it to you? Do you know Plum Creek?"
"No."
"It's the next station. Train will be there in an hour, and we'll stop there 10 minutes. In the 10 minutes several revolver shots can be exchanged."
"Very well. I'll stop at Plum Creek."
"And I guess you'll stay there, too."
"Who knows?" said Fogg, returning to the car as coolly as usual. He began to reassure Ouda, telling her that blusterers were never to be feared, and begged Fix to be his second at the approaching duel, a request which the detective could not refuse. Mr. Fogg resumed the interrupted game with perfect calmness. At 11 o'clock the locomotive's whistle announced that they were approaching Plum Creek Station. Mr. Fogg rose and, accompanied by Fix, went out upon the platform. Passepartout accompanied him, carrying a pair of revolvers. Auda remained in the car, pale as death. The door of the next car opened, and Colonel Proctor appeared on the platform, attended by a Yankee of his own stamp as his second. But just as the combatants were about to step off from the train, the conductor hurried up and said, "You can't get off, gentlemen."
"Why not?"
"We're 20 minutes late, and we won't stop."
"But I'm going to fight a duel with this gentleman."
"I'm very sorry, but we have to be off at once. There's the bell ringing now." The train started. "I'm really sorry, gentlemen. Under any other circumstances I'd have been happy to oblige you, but after all, as you not have had time to fight here, why not fight as we go along?"
That wouldn't be convenient, perhaps, for this gentleman."
"It would be perfectly so," replied Fogg. "Well, we really are in America, and the conductor's a gentleman of the first order." So muttering this, Passepartout followed his master. The two combatants, their seconds, and the conductor passed through the cars to the rear of the train. The last car was only occupied by a dozen passengers, whom the conductor politely asked if they would be so kind as to leave it vacant for a few moments, as the two gentlemen had an affair of honour to settle. The passengers granted the request with alacrity, and straightway disappeared onto the platform. The car, which was some 50 feet long, was very convenient for their purpose. The adversaries might march on each other at the aisle and fire at their ease. Neither was duel more easily arranged. Mr. Fogg and Colonel Proctor, each provided with 2 6-barreled revolvers, entered the car. The seconds, remaining outside, shut them in. They were to begin firing at the first whistle of the locomotive, and after an interval of 2 minutes, what remained of the two gentlemen would be taken from the car. Nothing could be more simple. Indeed, it was all so simple. Fix and Passepartout felt their hearts beating as if they would crack. They were listening for the whistle agreed upon, when suddenly savage cries resounded in the air, accompanied by reports which certainly didn't issue from the car where the duelists were. The reports continued in front, and at the whole length of the train. Cries of terror proceeded from the interior of the cars. Colonel Proctor and Mr. Fogg, revolvers in hand, hastily quitted their prison and rushed forward where the noise was most clamorous. Then they perceived that the train was attacked by a band of Sioux. This wasn't the first attempt of these daring natives, for there was more than once that they had waylaid trains on the road. 100 of them had, according to their habit, jumped upon the steps without stopping the train, with the ease of a clown mounting a horse at full gallop. The Sioux were armed with guns, from which came the reports, to which the passengers, who were almost all armed, responded by revolver shots. They had first mounted the engine and half stunned the engineer and stoker with blows from their muskets. A Sioux chief, wishing to stop the train but not knowing how to work the regulator, had opened wide instead of closing the steam valve, and the locomotive was plunging forward with terrific velocity. The Sioux had at the same time invaded the cars, skipping like enraged monkeys over the roofs, thrusting open the doors, and fighting hand to hand with the passengers. Penetrating the baggage car, they pillaged it, throwing the trunks out of the train. The cries and shots were constant, and the travelers defended themselves bravely. Some of the cars were barricaded and sustained a siege like moving forts carried along at a speed of 100 miles an hour. Auda behaved courageously from the first. She defended herself like a true heroine with a revolver, which she shot through the broken windows whenever a native made his appearance. 20 Sioux had fallen mortally wounded to the ground, and the wheels crushed those who fell upon the rails as if they'd been worms. Several passengers, shot or stunned, lay on the seats. It was necessary to put an end to the struggle, which had lasted for 10 minutes, and which would result in the triumph of the Sioux if the train were not stopped. Fort Kearny Station, where there was a garrison, was 2 miles distant, but that once that had passed, the Sioux would be the masters of the train between Fort Kearny and the station beyond. The conductor was fighting beside Mr. Fogg when he was shot and fell. At the same moment he cried, "Unless the train stopped in 5 minutes, we're lost." "It shall be stopped," said Fogg, preparing to rush from the car. "Stay, monsieur, I will go." Mr. Fogg had not time to stop the brave fellow, who, opening a door unperceived by the natives, succeeded in slipping under the car, and while the struggle continued and the balls whizzed around each other over his head, he made use of his old acrobatic experience, and with amazing agility worked his way under the cars, holding onto the chains, aiding himself by the brakes and edges of the sashes, creeping from one car to another with marvelous skill, and thus gaining the forward end of the train. There, suspended by one hand between the baggage car and the tender, with the other he loosened the safety chains. But owing to the traction, he never would have succeeded in unscrewing the yoking bar, had not a violent concussion jolted the bar out. The train, now detached from the engine, remained a little behind while the locomotive rushed forward with increased speed. Carried on by the force already acquired, the train still moved for several minutes, but the brakes were worked, and at last they stopped, less than 100 feet from Kye&I station. The soldiers of the fort, attracted by the shots, hurried up. The Sioux hadn't expected them, and decamped in a body. The Sioux had not expected them, and decamped in a body before the truth entirely stopped. But when the passengers counted each other on the station platform, several were found missing, among others a courageous Frenchman, whose devotion had just saved them. Chapter 30, in which Phileas Fogg simply does his duty. 3 passengers, included Passepartout, had disappeared. Had they been killed in the struggle? Were they taken prisoners by the Sioux? It was impossible to tell. There were many wounded, but not mortally. Colonel Proctor was one of the most seriously hurt. He'd fought bravely, and a ball had entered his groin. He was carried into the station with other wounded passengers to receive such attention as could be of avail. Aouda was safe, and Phileas Fogg, who had been in the thickest of the fight, had not received a scratch. Fix was slightly wounded in the arm, but Passepartout was not to be found, and tears coursed down Aouda's cheeks. All the passengers had gotten out of the train, the wheels of which were stained with blood. From the tires and spokes hung ragged pieces of flesh. As far as the eye could reach on the white plain behind, red trails were visible. The last Sioux were disappearing in the south, along the banks of the Republican River. Mr. Fogg, with folded arms, remained motionless. He had a serious decision to make. Aouda, standing near him, looked at him without speaking, and he understood her look. If his servant was a prisoner, ought he not to risk everything to rescue him from the natives? "I'll find him, living or dead," he said quietly to Aouda. "Oh, Mr. Fogg!" she cried, clasping his hands and covering them with tears. "Living, if we don't lose a moment." Fogg, by this resolution, inevitably sacrificed himself. He pronounced his own doom. The delay of a single day would make him lose the steamer at New York, and his bet would be certainly lost. But he thought, "It is my duty," and he didn't hesitate. The commanding officer of Fort Kye&I was there, and 100 of his soldiers had placed themselves in position to defend the station should the Sioux attack it. "Sir," said Fogg to the captain, 3 passengers have disappeared." "Dead?" "Dead or prisoners. That is the uncertainty which must be solved. Do you propose to pursue the Sioux?" "That's a serious thing to do, sir. These folks may retreat beyond the Arkansas. I can't leave the fort unprotected." The lives of 3 men are in question, sir." "Doubtless, but can I risk the lives of 50 men to save 3? "I don't know whether you can, sir, but you ought to." "Nobody here has a right to teach me my duty." "Very well, I'll go alone." "You, sir?" said Fick, coming up. "You alone in the pursuit of them?" "Would you have me leave this poor fellow to perish? Him to whom every one present owes his life? I shall go." "No, sir, you won't go alone," cried the captain, touched in spite of himself. "You're a brave man. I need 30 volunteers," he said, turning to his soldiers. "Thank you, Captain." "Will you let me go with you?" "Do as you please, sir, but if you wish to do me a favor, you will remain with Aouda, in case something should happen to me." A sudden pallor overspread the detective's face. separate himself from the man who had so persistently followed step by step, leave him to wander about in this desert? Fix gazed attentively at Mr. Fogg, and, despite his suspicions and that of the struggle which was going on within him, lowered his eyes before that calm and frank look. "I'll stay." A few moments later, after Mr. Fogg had pressed the young woman's hand, and having confided to her his precious carpet-bag, went off with the sergeant and his little squad. But before going, he said to the soldiers, "My friends, I will divide $5,000 among you if we save the prisoners." It was then a little past noon. Auda retired to the waiting room, and there she waited alone, thinking of the simple and noble generosity, the tranquil courage of Phileas Fogg. He had sacrificed his fortune, and was now risking his life, all without hesitation, from duty and silence. Fix didn't have the same thought, and could scarcely conceal his agitation. He walked feverishly up and down the platform, but soon resumed his outer composure. He now saw the folly of which he had been guilty in letting Fogg go alone. What! This man whom he just followed around the world was permitted now to separate himself from him? He began to accuse and abuse instead, and as if he were directors of the police, administered to himself a second lecture for his greenness. "I've been an idiot, and this brain'll see it. He's gone and won't come back. But how is it that I have in my pocket a watch for a warrant for his arrest? I've been so fascinated by him. Decidedly, I'm nothing but a rear end." So reasoned the detective, while the hours slipped by too slowly. He didn't know what to do. Sometimes he was tempted to tell Auda all, but he worried the young woman would not perceive his confidences. What course should he take? He thought of pursuing Fogg across the great vast plains. It didn't seem really impossible that he might overtake him. Where was I? Where was I? That's a good question. Waiting room. Footsteps were easily printed on the snow, but soon under a fresh sheet every imprint would be discovered. Fix became discouraged. He felt a sort of insurmountable longing to abandon the game altogether. He could now leave Fort Kearney Station and pursue his journey homeward in peace. Towards 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while it was snowing hard, long whistles were heard approaching from the east. A great shadow, preceded by a great light, slowly advanced, appearing still larger through the mist, which gave it a fantastic aspect. No train had been expected from the east, at least none of this style. The locomotive, which was slowly approaching with deafening whistles, was that which, having been detached from the train, had continued its route with such terrific rapidity, carrying off the unconscious engineer and stoker. It had run several miles when, the fire beginning too low to want of that, the steam had slackened, and it had finally stopped for an hour after. Sorry, I completely lost my space there. When the fire becoming low for want of fuel, the steam had slackened, and had finally stopped for an hour after, some 20 miles beyond Fort Kearney. Neither the engineer nor the stoker was dead, and after remaining for some time in their swoon, had come to themselves. The train had them stopped. The engineer, when he found himself in the desert, And the locomotive without cars understood what had happened. He couldn't imagine how the locomotive had become separated from the train, but he didn't doubt that the train left behind was in distress. He didn't hesitate what to do. It'd be prudent to continue on to Omaha, for it would be dangerous to return to the train, which the Indians might still be engaged in pillaging. Nevertheless, he began to rebuild the fire in the furnace, and the pressure again mounted, and the locomotive returned, running backwards to Fort Kye&I. This is what it was whistling in the mist. The travelers were glad to see the locomotive resume its place at the head of the train. They could now continue the journey so terribly uninterrupted. Auda, on seeing the locomotive come up, hurried out of the station and asked the conductor, "Are we going to start?"
"At once, madam."
"But the prisoners, our unfortunate fellow travelers."
"I cannot interrupt the tramp," replied the collector. "We are shelter. We are already 3 hours behind time."
"But and when will another train pass here from San Francisco?"
"Tomorrow evening, madam."
"Tomorrow evening? But then it'll be too late. We must wait."
"It's impossible. If you wish to go, please get in."
"I will not go." Fix had heard this conversation a little while before when there was no prospect of proceeding on the journey. He had made up his mind to leave Fort Kye&I, but now that the train was there ready to start, and he had only to take a seat in the car, an irresistible influence held him back. The station platform burned my feet. He couldn't stir. The conflict in his mind began again. Anger and failure settled him. He just wanted to struggle on to the end. Meanwhile, the passengers and some of the wounded, among them Colonel Proctor, whose injuries were serious, had their places in the train. The buzzing of overheated boiler was heard, and the steam was soon escaping from the valves. The engineer whistled. The train started and soon disappeared, enough to mingle its white smoke with the eddies of densely falling snow. The detective, however, had remained behind. Several hours passed. The weather was dismal, and it was very cold. Fix sat motionless on a bench in the station. He thought he might have been asleep. Auda, despite the storm, kept coming out of the waiting room, getting to the end of the platform and greeting with the tempest of snow, as if to price the mist which had narrowed the horizon around her, and to hear, if possible, some welcome sound. She heard and saw nothing. Then she would return, chilled but through. He tried to conceal apprehensions. As night approached, the snow fell less plentifully, but it became intensely cold. Absolute silence rested on the plains. Neither bird nor flight of them, nor passing of beast, stomped the troubled plain. Throughout the night, Auda, full of sad forebodings, her heart stifled with anguish, wandered on about the verge of the plants. Her imagination carried her far off, and showed her innumerable dangers, which she suffered through the long hours. It would be impossible to describe. Fix remained stationary in the same place, but he didn't sleep. Once a man approached and spoke to him, and the detective merely replied by shaking his head. Thus the night passed. At dawn, the half-extinguished disk of the sun rose above a misty horizon, but it was now possible to recognize objects 2 miles off. Phileas Fogg and the squad that had gone southward. In the south, it was all vacancy. It was then 7 o'clock. The captain, who was really alarmed, didn't know what course to take. Should he send another detachment to the rescue of the first? Should he sacrifice more men with so few chances of saving those already sacrificed? His hesitation didn't last long, however. Calling one of his lieutenants, he was on the point of ordering a reconnaissance when gunshots were heard. Was it a signal? The soldiers rushed out of the fort, and half a mile off they perceived a little band returning in good order. Mr. Fogg was marching at their head, and just behind him were Passepartout and the other 2 travelers, rescued from the Sioux. They had met and fought the Indians 10 miles south of Fort Kearny. Before the detachment arrived, Passepartout and his companions began to struggle with their captors, 3 of whom the Frenchman had felled with his fists, when his master and soldiers all hastened up to their relief. All are welcomed with joyful cries. Hang on, this is Phileas Fogg. All were welcomed with joyful cries. Phileas Fogg distributed the reward he had promised to the soldiers, while Passepartout, not without reason, muttered to himself, "It must be certainly confessed that I cost my master dearly." Fix, without saying a word, looked at Mr. Fogg, and it would have been difficult to analyze the thoughts which struggled within him. As for Ouda, she took her protector's hand and pressed it in her own, too moved to speak. Meanwhile, Passepartout was looking about the train. He thought he should find it there, ready to start for Omaha, and he thought the train lost might be regained. The train. Gone. And when does the next train pass here? Not till this evening. Ah. On that note, we're going to take a short intermission. If you're listening to this on YouTube as a recording, feel free to pause the video and go get some water, maybe some snacks, get your stretch on. You know, that's important. You don't want to sit still for too long. Welcome back. I hope you guys had a good break. Let's get into it. Chapter 31, in which Fix, the detective, considerably furthers the interests of Phileas Fogg. Phileas Fogg found himself 20 hours behind time. Passepartout, the involuntary cause of this delay, was desperate. He had ruined his master. At this moment the detective approached Mr. Fogg, and looking him intently in the face, said, "Seriously, sir, are you in great haste?" "Quite seriously." "I have a purpose in asking. It is absolutely necessary that you should be in New York on the 11th, before 9 o'clock in the evening, the time that the steamer leaves for Liverpool." "It is absolutely necessary."
"And if your journey had not been interrupted by these natives, well, you'd have reached New York on the morning of the 11th?"
"Yes, with 11 hours to spare before the steamer left."
"Good. You're therefore 20 hours behind. 12 from 20 leaves 8. You must regain 8 hours. Do you wish to try to do so?"
"On foot?"
"No, in a sledge. On a sledge with sails. A man's proposed such a method to me."
It was the man who had spoken to Fix during the night, and whose offer he had refused. Phileas Fogg didn't reply at once, but Fix, having pointed out the man who was walking up and down in front of the station, Mr. Fogg went up to him. An instant after, Mr. Fogg and the American, whose name was Mudge, entered a hut built just below the fort. There Mr. Fogg examined a curious vehicle, a kind of frame upon 2 long beams, a little raised in front like the runners of a sledge, and upon which there was room for 5 or 6 persons. A high mast was fixed on the frame, held firmly by metallic lashings, to which there was attached a large brigantine sail. This mast held an iron stay, upon which to hoist a jibsail. Behind, a sort of rudder served to guide the vehicle. It was, in short, a sledge rigged like a sloop. During the winter, when the trains are blocked up by the snow, these sledges make extremely rapid journeys across the frozen plains from one station to another. Provided with more sails than a cutter, and with the wind behind them, they slip over the surface of the prairies with a speed equal, if not superior, to that of the express trains. Mr. Fogg readily made a bargain with the owner of this land craft. The wind was favorable, being fresh and blowing from the west. The snow had hardened, and Mudge was very confident of being able to transport Mr. Fogg in a few hours to Omaha. Thence the trains eastward run frequently to Chicago and New York. It wasn't impossible that the lost time might yet be recovered, and such an opportunity was not to be rejected. Not wishing to expose Auda to the discomforts of traveling in the open air, Mr. Fogg proposed to leave her with Passepartout at Fort Kearny, the servant taking upon himself to escort her to Europe by a better route and under more favorable conditions. But Auda refused to separate from Mr. Fogg, and Passepartout was delighted with her decision, for nothing could induce him to leave his master while Fix was with him. It'd be difficult to guess the detective's thoughts. Was this conviction shaken by Phileas Fogg's return, or did he still regard him as an exceedingly shrewd rascal who, his journey round the world completed, would think himself absolutely safe in England? Perhaps Fix's opinion of Phileas Fogg was somewhat modified, but he was nevertheless resolved to do his duty and to hasten the return of the whole party to England as much as possible. At 8 o'clock the sledge was ready to start. The passengers took their places on it and wrapped themselves closely up in their traveling cloaks. The two great sails were hoisted, and under the pressure of the wind, the sledge slid over the hardened snow with a velocity of 40 miles an hour. The distance between Fort Kearny and Omaha, as the birds fly, is at most 200 miles. If the wind held good, the distance might be traversed in 5 hours. If no accident happened, the sledge might reach Omaha by 1 o'clock. What a journey! The travelers, huddled close together, would not speak for the cold, intensified by the rapidity at which they were going. The sledge sped on as lightly as a boat over the waves. When the breeze came skimming the earth, the sledge seemed to be lifted off the ground by its sails. Mudge, who was at the rudder, kept in a straight line, and by a turn of his hand checked the lurches which the vehicle had a tendency to make. All the sails were up, and the jib was arranged as to not screen the brigantine. A topmast was hoisted, and another jib, held out to the wind, added its force to the other sails. Although the speed could not exactly be estimated, the sledge could not have been going at any less than 40 miles an hour. "If nothing breaks, we'll get there," said Mudge. Mr. Fogg had made it for Mudge's interest to reach Omaha within the time agreed on by the offer of a rather handsome reward. The prairie, across which the sledge was moving in a straight line, was as flat as a sea. It seemed like a vast frozen lake. The railroad which ran through this section ascended from the southwest to the northwest by the great island Columbus, an important Nebraska town, Schuyler, and Fremont to Omaha. It followed throughout the right bank of the Platte River, and the sledge, shortening this route, took a course to the arc described by the railway. Mudge was not afraid of being stopped by the Platte River because it was frozen. The road, then, was quite clear of obstacles, and Phileas Fogg had but two things to fear: an accident to the sled, and a change or calm in the wind. But the breeze, far from lessening its force, blew as if to bend the mast, which, however, the metallic lashings held firmly. These lashings, like the chords of a stringed instrument, resonated as if vibrated by a violin bow. The sledge slid along in the midst of a plaintively intense melody. "Those chords give the fifth in the octave." These were the only words he uttered along the journey. Auda, cosily packed in furs and cloaks, was sheltered as much as possible from the attacks of the freezing wind. As for Passepartout, his face was as red as the sun's disk when it sets in the mist, and he laboriously inhaled the biting air. With his natural buoyancy of spirits, he began to hope again. They would reach New York on the evening, if not on the morning, of the 11th, and there were still some chances that it would be before the steamer sailed for Liverpool. Passepartout even felt a strong desire to grasp his ally, Fix, by the hand. He remembered that it was the detective who procured the sledge, the only means of reaching Omaha in time, but, checked by some presentiment, he kept his usual reserve. One thing, however, Passepartout would never forget, and that was the sacrifice which Mr. Fogg had made without hesitation to rescue him from the Sioux. Mr. Fogg had risked his fortune and his life. His servant would never forget that. While each of the party was absorbed in reflections so different, the sledge flew past over the vast carpet of snow. The creeks it passed over were not perceived. Fields and stream disappeared under the uniform whiteness. The plain was absolutely deserted. Between the Union Pacific Road and the branch which unites Kye&I with St. Joseph, it formed a great uninhabited island. Neither village, station, nor fort appeared, and from time to time they sped by some phantom-like tree whose white skeleton twisted and rattled in the wind. Sometimes flocks of wild birds rose, or bands of gaunt, famished, ferocious prairie wolves ran howling after the sledge. Passepartout, revolver in hand, held himself ready to fire on those which came too near. Had an accident then happened to the sledge, the travelers, attacked by these beasts, would have been in the most terrible danger, but it held on its even course, and soon gained on the wolves, and ere long left the howling band at a safe distance behind. About noon, Mudge perceived by certain landmarks that he was crossing the Platte River. He said nothing, but felt certain that he was now within 20 miles of Omaha. In less than an hour he left the rudder and furled his sails, while the sledge, carried on by the great impetus the wind had given it, went on half a mile further with its sails unspread. It stopped at last, and Mudge, pointing to a mass of roofs wet with snow, said, "We got there." Arrived at the station, which is in daily communication by numerous trains with the Atlantic seaboard. Passepartout and Fix jumped off, stretched their stiffened limbs, and aided Mr. Fogg and the young woman to descend from the sledge. Fogg generously rewarded Mudge, whose hand Passepartout warmly grasped, and the party directed their steps to the Omaha railway station. The Pacific Railroad proper finds its terminus at this important Nebraska town. Omaha is connected with Chicago by the Chicago and Rock Island Railroads, which run directly east and pass 50 stations. A train was ready to start when Mr. Fogg and his party reached the station, and they had only time to get into the cars. They had seen nothing of Omaha, but Passepartout confessed to himself that this was not to be regretted, as they were not traveling to see the sights after all. The train passed rapidly across the state of Iowa, by Council Bluff, Des Moines, and Iowa City. During the night it crossed the Mississippi at Davenport, and by Rock Island entered Illinois. The next day, which was the 10th, at 4 o'clock in the evening it reached Chicago, already risen from its ruins, and more proudly seated than ever on the borders of its beautiful Lake Michigan. 900 miles separated Chicago from New York, but trains are not wanting at Chicago. Mr. Fogg passed at once from one to the other, and the locomotive of the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railway left at full speed, as if it fully comprehended that the gentleman had no time to lose. It traversed Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey like a flash, rushing through towns with antique names, some of which had streets and car tracks, but as yet had no houses. At last the Hudson came into view, and at 11:15 in the evening of the 11th, the train stopped in the station on the right bank of the river, before the very pier of the Cunard line. The China for Liverpool had started 3/4 of an hour before. Chapter 32, in which Phileas Fogg engages in a direct struggle with bad fortune. The China, in leaving, seemed to have carried off Phileas Fogg's last hope. None of the other steamers were able to serve his projects. The Perrier of the French Transatlantic Company, whose admirable steamers are equal to any in speed and comfort, didn't leave until the 14th. The Hamburg boats didn't go directly to Liverpool or London, but to Havre, and the additional trip from Havre to Southampton would render Phileas Fogg's last efforts of no avail. The Inman steamer didn't depart until the next day, and couldn't cross the Atlantic in time to save the wager. Fogg learned all this in consulting his Bradshaw, which gave him the daily movements of the transatlantic steamers. Passepartout was crushed. It overwhelmed him to lose the boat by 3/4 of an hour. It was his fault, for instead of helping his master, he had ceased putting obstacles in his path. And when he recalled all the incidents of the tour, when he counted up the sums expended in pure loss and on his own account, when he thought that the immense stake, added to the heavy charges of the useless journey, would completely ruin Mr. Fogg, he overwhelmed himself with bitter self-accusations. Mr. Fogg, however, didn't reproach him, and on leaving the Cunard pier, only said, We will consult about what is best tomorrow. Come along." The party crossed the Hudson in the Jersey City ferryboat and drove in a carriage to the St. Nicholas Hotel on Broadway. Rooms were engaged, and the night passed briefly to Phileas Fogg, who slept profoundly but very long, to Auda and the others, whose agitation didn't exactly permit them to rest. The next day was the 12th of December. From 7 in the morning of the 12th to a quarter before 9 in the evening of the 21st, there were 9 days, 13 hours, and 45 minutes. If Phileas Fogg had left in the China, one of the fastest steamers on the Atlantic, he would have reached Liverpool and then London within the period agreed upon. Mr. Fogg left the hotel alone after giving Passepartout instructions to await his return and inform Auda to be ready at an instant's notice. He proceeded to the banks of the Hudson and looked about among the vessels moored or anchored in the river for any that were about to depart. Several had departure signals and were preparing to be put to sea at morning tide, for in this immense and admirable port there is not one day in 100 that vessels do not set out for every corner of the globe. But they were mostly sailing vessels, of which, of course, Phileas Fogg could make no use. He seemed about to be giving up on all hope, when he espied, anchored at the battery, a cable's length off at most, a trading vessel, with a screw well shaped, whose funnel, puffing a cloud of smoke, indicated she was getting ready for the departure. Phileas Fogg hailed a boat, got into it, and soon found himself on board the Henrietta, an iron-hulled wood built above. He ascended to the deck and asked for the captain, who forthwith presented himself. He was a man of 50, a sort of sea-wolf, with big eyes, a complexion of oxidized copper, red hair and thick neck, and a growling voice. "Is this the captain?"
"I'm the captain."
"I'm Phileas Fogg of London."
"And I'm Andrew Speedy at Cardiff."
"You're going to put to sea?"
"In an hour."
"You bound for?"
"Bordeaux."
"And your cargo?"
"No freight, going in ballast."
"Have you any passengers?"
"No passengers. Never have passengers, too much in the way."
"Is your vessel a swift one?"
"Between 11 and 12 knots. Henrietta's well known."
"Will you carry me and 3 other persons to Liverpool?"
"To Liverpool? Why not to China?"
"I said Liverpool."
"No."
"No?"
"No, I'm setting out for Bordeaux, and we'll go to Bordeaux."
"Money's no object?"
"None."
The captain spoke in a tone which didn't admit of a reply. "But the owners of the Henrietta?"
"The owners are myself. The vessel belongs to me."
"I'll freight it for you."
"No."
"I'll buy it."
"No."
Fogg didn't betray the least disappointment, but the situation was a grave one. It was not at New York as at Hong Kong, nor with the captain of the Henrietta as with the captain of the Tankadere. Up to this time, money had smoothed away every obstacle, and now money failed. Still, some means must be found to cross the Atlantic on a boat, unless by balloon, which would have been venturesome, besides not being capable of being put in practice. It seemed that Phileas Fogg had an idea, for he said to the captain, "Well, will you carry me to Bordeaux?"
"No, not if you paid me $200.
"I'll offer you 2,000.
"Apiece?"
"Apiece."
"They're for you?"
"4." Speedy began to scratch his head at this. There was $8,000 to gain, without changing his route, for which it was well worth conquering the repugnance he had for all kinds of passengers. Besides, passengers at $2,000 are no longer passengers, but valuable merchandise.
"I start at 9 o'clock. You and your party ready?"
"We'll be on board at 9 o'clock," replied no less simply Mr. Fogg. It was 8:30. To disembark from the Henrietta, jump into a hack, hurry to the St. Nicholas, and return with Auda, Passepartout, and even the inseparable Fix, was the work of a brief time, and was performed by Mr. Fogg with a coolness which never abandoned him. They were on board when the Henrietta made to weigh anchor. When Passepartout heard what this last voyage was going to cost, he muttered a prolonged "Oh!" which extended throughout his vocal gamut. As for Fix, he said to himself that the Bank of England would certainly not come out of this affair well indemnified. When they reached England, even if Mr. Fogg didn't throw some handfuls of bank bills into the sea, more than £7,000 would be spent. Chapter 33. Ooh, spooky 33. In which Phileas Fogg shows himself equal to the occasion. An hour after, the Henrietta passed the lighthouse, which marks the entrance of the Hudson, turned the point of Sandy Hook, and put out to sea. During the day she skirted Long Island, passed Fire Island, and directed her course rapidly eastward. At noon the next day, a man mounted the bridge to ascertain the vessel's position. It might be thought that this was Captain Speedy. Not the least in the world. It was Phileas Fogg, Esquire. As for Speedy, he was shut up in his cabin under lock and key, and was uttering loud cries which signified an anger at once pardonable and excessive. What happened was very simple. Fogg wished to go to Liverpool, but the captain wouldn't carry him there. Then Fogg had taken passage for Bordeaux, and during the 30 hours he had been on board, had so shrewdly managed his banknotes that the sailors and stokers, who were only an occasional crew, not on the best terms with the captain, went over to him in a body. This is why Fogg was in command instead of Speedy, why the captain was a prisoner in his own cabin, and why, in short, the Henrietta was directing her course toward Liverpool. It was very clear, to see Mr. Fogg manage the craft, that he had been a sailor. How the adventure ended will be seen anon. Out was anxious, though she said nothing. As for Passepartout, she thought Mr. Fogg's maneuver thought Mr. Fogg's maneuver simply glorious. The captain had said between 11 and 12 knots, and the Henrietta did confirm his prediction. If there were ifs still, the sea didn't become too boisterous, if the wind didn't veer around to the east, if no accident happened to the boat or its machinery, the Henrietta might cross the 3,000 miles from New York to Liverpool in the 9 days, between the 12th and 21st of December. It's true that once arrived, the affair on board the Henrietta, added to that of the Bank of the England, might create more difficulties for Mr. Fogg than he imagined or could desire. During the first days they went along smoothly enough. The sea was not very unpropitious. The wind seemed stationary in the northeast, the sails were hoisted, and the Henrietta ploughed through the waves like a real transatlantic steamer. Passepartout was delighted. His master's last exploit, the consequences of which he ignored, enchanted him. Never had the crew seen so jolly and dexterous a fellow. He formed warm friendships with the sailors, and amazed them with his acrobatic feats. He thought they managed the vessel like gentlemen, and that the stokers fired up like heroes. His loquacious good humour infected everyone. He'd only forgotten the past, its vexations and its delays. He'd only thought of the end, so nearly accomplished, and sometimes he boiled over with his impatience, as if heated by the furnaces of the Henrietta. Often, also, the worthy fellow revolved around Fix, looking him with a keen, distrustful eye, but he didn't speak to him, for their old intimacy no longer existed. Fix, it must be confessed, understood nothing of what was going on. The conquest of the Henrietta, the bribery of the crew, Fogg managing the boat like a skilled seaman, amazed and confused him. He didn't know what to think. After all, a man who began by stealing £55,000 might end by stealing a vessel, and Fix was not unnaturally inclined to conclude that the Henrietta, under Fogg's command, was not going to Liverpool at all, but to some part of the world where the robber, turned into a pirate, would quietly put himself in safety. The conjecture was at least a plausible one, and the detective began to seriously regret that he had embarked on the affair. As for Captain Speedy, he continued to howl and growl in his cabin, and Passepartout, whose duty it was to carry him his meals, courageous as it was, took the greatest precautions. Fogg didn't even seem to know that there was a captain on board. On the 13th they passed the edge of the banks of Newfoundland, a dangerous locality. During the winter especially there are frequent fogs and heavy gales of wind. Ever since the evening before, the barometer, suddenly falling, had indicated an approaching change in the atmosphere, and during the night the temperature varied. The cold became sharper, and the wind veered to the southeast. This was a misfortune. Mr. Fogg, in order to not deviate from his course, furled his sails and increased the force of the steam, but the vessel's speed slackened, owing to the state of the sea, the long waves which broke against the stern. She pitched violently, and this slowed her progress. The breeze, little by little, swelled into a tempest, and it was feared that the Henrietta might not be able to maintain herself upright on the waves. Passepartout's visage darkened with the skies, and for 2 days the poor fellow experienced constant fright. But Phileas Fogg was a bold mariner, and knew how to maintain a headway against the sea, and he kept on his course without even decreasing his steam. The Henrietta, when she couldn't rise upon the waves, crossed them, swamping her deck, but passing safely. Sometimes the screw rose out of the water, beating its protruding end, when a mountain of water raised the stern above the waves, but the craft always kept straight ahead. The wind, however, didn't grow as boisterous as might have been feared. It was one of those tempests which burst and rushed on with a speed of 90 miles an hour. It continued fresh, but unhappily it remained obstinately in the southeast, rendering the sails useless. The 16th of December was the 75th day since Phileas Fogg's departure from London, and the Henrietta had not been seriously yet delayed. Half of the voyage was almost accomplished, and the worst localities had been passed. In summer, success had been well nigh certain. In winter, they were at the mercy of the bad season. Passepartout said nothing, but he cherished hope in secret, and comforted himself with the reflection that if the wind failed them, they might still count on the steam. On this day the engineer came on deck, went up to Mr. Fogg, and began to speak earnestly with him. Without knowing why it was a presentiment, perhaps Passepartout became vaguely uneasy. He would have given one of his ears to hear what the other what the engineer was saying. He finally managed to catch a few words, and was sure he heard his master say, "You're certain of what you tell me?"
"Certain, sir. You must remember that since we started we kept up hot fires in all our furnaces, and though we had coal enough to go on short steam from New York to Bordeaux, we haven't enough to go with all steam from New York to Liverpool."
"I will consider." Passepartout understood it all. He was seized with mortal anxiety. The coal was about to give out. "Well, if my master cannot get over that, if my master can get over that, he'll be a famous man." He couldn't help imparting to Fix what he'd overheard.
"Then you really believe we're going to Liverpool?"
"Of course."
"You buffoon,"
replied the detective, shrugging his shoulders and turning on his heel. Passepartout was on the point of vigorously resenting the epithet, the reason of which he could for the life of him comprehend, but he reflected that the unfortunate Fix was probably very much disappointed and humiliated in his self-esteem after having so awkwardly followed a false scent around the world and refrained. And now what course could Phileas Fogg adopt? It was difficult to imagine. Nevertheless, he seemed to have decided upon one, for that evening he sent for the engineer and said to him, Feed all the fires until the coal is exhausted." A few moments later, the funnel of the Henrietta vomited forth torrents of smoke. The vessel continued to proceed with all steam on, but on the 18th the engineer, as he predicted, announced that the coal would give out in the course of the day. "Do not let the fires go down. Keep them up to the last. Let the valves be filled." Toward noon, Phileas Fogg, having ascertained their position, called Passepartout and ordered him to go for Captain Speedy. It was as if the honest fellow had been commanded to unchain a tiger. He went to the captain, saying to himself, he will be like a madman." In a few moments, with cries and oaths, a bomb appeared on the poop deck, and that bomb was Captain Speedy. It was clear that he was on the point of bursting. "Where are we?" were the first words his anger permitted him to utter. Had the poor man been an apoplectic, he could never have recovered from his paroxysm of wrath. "Where are we?" he repeated, his face purple with anger. 707 miles from Liverpool," said Fogg with imperturbable calmness.
"Pirate?"
"I've sent for you, sir."
"Pepperoon?"
"Sir, to ask me to sell you... well, to ask you to sell me your vessel."
"No, by all the devils, no."
"But I shall be obliged to burn her."
"Burn the Henrietta."
"At least the upper part of her. The coal's given out."
"Burn my vessel?"
cried Captain Speedy, who could scarcely pronounce the words.
"Vessel worth $50,000.
"Here are 60,000, replied Fogg, handing the captain a roll of bank bills. This had a prodigious effect on Andrew Speedy. An American can scarcely remain unmoved at the sight of $60,000. The captain forgot in an instant his anger, his imprisonment, and all grudges against his passenger. The Henrietta was 20 years old. It was a great bargain. The bomb would not go off after all. Mr. Fogg had taken away the match.
"And I'll still have the iron hull."
The iron hull and the engine. Is it agreed?"
"Agreed."
And Speedy, seizing the banknotes, counted them and consigned them to his pocket. During this colloquy, Passepartout was as white as a sheet, and Fix seemed on the point of having an apoplectic fit. Nearly 20,000 pounds had been expended, and Fogg left the hull and engine to the captain. That is near the whole value of the craft. It was true, however, that 55,000 pounds had been stolen from the bank. When Andrew Speedy had pocketed the money, Fogg said to him, "Don't let this astonish you, sir. You must know that I shall lose 20,000 pounds unless I arrive in London by a quarter before 9 on the evening of 21st of December. I missed the steamer at New York, and you refused to take me to Liverpool."
"And I did well. I gained at least $40,000 by it,"
he added more sedately.
Do you know one thing, Captain
Fogg?
Captain Fogg, you got something of the Yankee about you."
And having paid his passenger what he considered a high compliment, he was going away, when Fogg said, "The vessel now belongs to me."
"Certainly, from the keel to the truck of the masts, all the wood, that is."
"Very well. Have the interior seats, bunks, and frames pulled down and burn them." It was necessary to have dry wood to keep the steam up to the adequate pressure, and on that day the poop deck, cabins, bunks, and the spare deck were sacrificed. On the next day, the 19th of December, the masts, rafts, and spars were burned. The crew worked lustily, keeping up the fires. Passepartout hewed, cut, and sawed away with all his might. This was a perfect rage for demolition. The railings, fittings, the greater part of the deck, and topsides disappeared on the 20th, and the Henrietta was now only a flat hulk. But on this day they sighted the Irish coast, and fastened it light. By 10 in the evening they were passing Queenstown. Phileas Fogg had only 24 hours more in which to get to London. That length of time was necessary to reach Liverpool with all steam on, and the steam was about to give out altogether.
"Sir,"
said Speedy, who was now deeply interested in Fogg's project,
"I really commiserate you. Everything's against you. We're only opposite Queenstown."
"Ah, is that the place where we see the lights, Queenstown?"
"Yes."
"Can we enter the harbour?"
"Not under 3 hours, only at high tide."
"Stay," replied Fogg calmly, without betraying in his features that by a supreme inspiration he was about to attempt once more to conquer ill fortune. Queenstown is the Irish port at which the transatlantic steamers stop to put off the mails. These mails are carried to Dublin by express trains always held in readiness to start. From Dublin they are sent on to Liverpool by the most rapid boats, and thus gain 12 hours on the Atlantic steamers. Phileas Fogg counted on gaining 12 hours in the same way. Instead of arriving at Liverpool the next evening by Henrietta, he'd be there by noon, and would therefore have time to reach London before a quarter before 9 in the evening. The Henrietta entered Queenstown harbour at 1 o'clock in the morning, it then being high tide, and Fogg, after being grasped heartily by the hand by Captain Speedy, left that gentleman on the levelled hulk of his craft, which was still worth half what he'd paid it for. The party went on shore at once. Fix was greatly tempted to arrest Mr. Fogg on the spot, but he didn't. Why? What struggle was going on within him? Had he changed his mind about his man? Did he understand that he'd made a grave mistake? He didn't, however, abandon Mr. Fogg. They all got upon the train, which was just about ready to start at 1:30. At the dawn of the day they were in Dublin, and they lost no time in embarking on a steamer which, disdaining to rise upon the waves, invariably cut through them. Phileas Fogg at last disembarked on the Liverpool quay 20 minutes before 12 on the 21st of December. He was only 6 hours distant from London. But at this moment Fix came up, put his hand upon Mr. Fogg's shoulder, and showing his warrant, said, "You really Phileas Fogg?" "I am."
"I arrest you in the Queen's name."
Chapter 34, in which Phileas Fogg at last reaches London. Fogg was in prison. He'd been shut up in the custom house, and he was to be transferred to London the next day. Passepartout, when he saw his master arrested, would have fallen upon Fix had he not been held back by some policemen. Auda was thunderstruck at the suddenness of an event which she couldn't understand. Passepartout explained to her how it was that the honest and courageous Fogg was arrested as a robber. The young woman's heart revolted against so heinous a charge, and when she saw that she could attempt to do nothing to save her protector, she wept bitterly. As for Fix, he had arrested Mr. Fogg because it was his duty, whether Mr. Fogg were guilty or not. The thought then struck Passepartout that he was the cause of this new misfortune. Had he not concealed Fix's errand from his master? When Fix revealed his true character and purpose, why had he not told Mr. Fogg? If the latter had been warned, he would no doubt have given Fix proof of his innocence, and satisfied him of his mistake. At least Fix would not have continued his journey at the expense and on the heels of his master, only to arrest him the moment he set foot on English soil. Passepartout wept until he was blind, and felt like ending it all. Auda and he had remained, despite the cold, under the portico of the custom-house. Neither wished to leave the place. Both were anxious to see Mr. Fogg again. That gentleman really was ruined, and that at the moment when he was about to attain his end, this arrest was fatal. Having arrived at Liverpool 20 minutes before 12 on the 21st of December, he had till a quarter before 9 that evening to reach the Reform Club. That is 9 hours and a quarter. The journey from Liverpool to London was 6 hours. If anyone at this moment had entered the custom-house, he would have found Mr. Fogg seated, motionless, calm, and without apparent anger upon a wooden bench. He was not, as it's true, resigned, but this last blow failed to force him into an outward betrayal of any emotion. Was he being devoured by one of those secret rages, all the more terrible because contained, which only burst forth with an irresistible force at the last moment? No one could tell. There he sat, calmly waiting for what? Did he still cherish hope? Did he still believe, now that the door of this prison was closed upon him, that he would succeed? However that may have been, Mr. Fogg carefully put his watch upon the table and observed its advancing hands. Not a word escaped his lips, but his look was singularly set and stern. This situation, in any event, was a terrible one, and might be thus stated. If Fogg was honest, he was ruined. If he was a knave, he was caught. Did escape occur to him? Did he examine to see if there was any practicable outlet from this prison? Did he think of escaping from it? Possibly, for once he walked slowly around the room. But the door was locked and the window heavily barred with iron rods. He sat down again and drew his journal from his pocket. On the line where these words were written, 21st December, Saturday, Liverpool, he added, 80th day, 11:40 a.m., and waited. The custom-house clock struck 1. Mr. Fogg observed that his watch was 2 hours too fast. 2 hours. Admitting that he was at this moment taking an express train, he could reach London and the Reform Club by a quarter before 9 p.m. His forehead slightly wrinkled. At 33 minutes past 2, he heard a singular noise outside and then a hasty opening of doors. Passepartout's voice was audible, and immediately after that, a Fix. Phileas Fogg's eyes brightened for a moment. The door swung open, and he saw Passepartout, Auda, and Fix, who hurried toward him. Fix was out of breath, and his hair was in disorder. He couldn't speak. Sir, forgive me. Most unfortunate resemblance. Robber arrested 3 days ago. You're free. Phileas Fogg was free. He walked to the detective, looked him steadily in the face, and with the only rapid motion he'd ever made in his life, or which he would ever make, drew back his arms, and with the precision of a machine, knocked Fix down. Well, yes, parbleu, that's what you might call a good application of English fists. Fix, who had found himself on the floor, didn't utter a word. He had only received his deserts. Mr. Fogg, Auda, and Passepartout left the custom-house without delay, got into a cab, and in a few moments descended at the station. Fogg asked if there was an express train about to leave for London. It was 40 minutes past 2. The express train had left 35 minutes before. Fogg then ordered a special train. There were several rapid locomotives on hand, but the railway arrangements didn't permit the special train to leave until 3 o'clock. At that hour, Phileas Fogg, having stimulated the engineer by the offer of a generous reward, at last set out toward London with Auda and his faithful servant. It was necessary to make the journey in 5 hours and a half, and this would have been easy on a clear road throughout. But there were forced delays, and when Fogg stepped from the train at the terminus, all the clocks in London were striking 10 minutes before 9. Having made the tour of the world, he was behindhand. 5 minutes. He'd lost the wager. Chapter 35, in which Phileas Fogg does not have to repeat his orders to Passepartout twice. The dwellers in Savile Row would have been surprised the next day if they'd been told that Phileas Fogg had returned home. His doors and windows were still closed. No appearance of change was visible. After leaving the station, Fogg gave Passepartout instructions to purchase some provisions and quietly went to his domicile. He bore his misfortune with habitual tranquillity, ruined, and by the blundering of the detective. After having steadily traversed that long journey, overcoming 100 obstacles, braving so many dangers, and still found time to do some good on his way, to fail so near the goal by a sudden event which he couldn't have foreseen and against which he was unarmed. It was terrible, but a few pounds were left of the large sum he had carried with him. There only remained of his fortune the £20,000 deposited at Baring's, and this amount he owed to his friends at the Reform Club. So great had been the expense of his tour that even had he won, it wouldn't have enriched him, and it's probable that he had not sought to enrich himself, being a man who rather laid wagers for honour's sake than the stake proposed. But this wager completely ruined him. Fogg's course, however, was fully decided upon. He knew what remained for him to do. A room in the house in Savile Row was set apart for Auda, who was overwhelmed with grief at her protector's misfortune. From the words which Mr. Fogg dropped, she saw that he was meditating some serious project. Knowing that Englishmen governed by a fixed idea sometimes resort to the desperate expedient, Passepartout kept a narrow watch upon his master, though he carefully concealed the appearance of so doing. First of all, the worthy fellow had gone up to his room and extinguished the gas burner, which had been burning for 80 days. He found in the letter-box a bill from the gas company, and he thought it more than time to put a stop to this expense which he had been doomed to bear. The night passed. Fogg went to bed, but did he sleep? Auda did not once close her eyes. Passepartout watched all night like a faithful dog at his master's door. Fogg called him in the morning and told him to get out his breakfast and a cup of tea and a chop for himself. He desired Auda to excuse him from breakfast and dinner, as his time would be absorbed all day in putting his affairs to rights. In the evening he would ask permission to have a few moments' conversation with the young lady. Passepartout, having received his orders, had nothing to do but to obey them. He looked at his imperturbable master, and could scarcely bring his mind to leave him. His heart was full, and his conscience tortured by remorse, for he accused himself more bitterly than ever of being the cause of the irretrievable disaster. Yes, had he warned Mr. Fogg, had he betrayed Fix's projects to him, his master would certainly not have given the detective passage to Liverpool, and Passepartout could hold in no longer. "My master, Mr. Fogg, why do you not curse me? It was my fault that—" "I blame no one," returned Fogg with perfect calmness. "Go." Passepartout left the room and went to find Auda, to whom he delivered his master's message. "Madam, I can do nothing myself. Nothing. I have no influence over my master, but you, perhaps—" "What influence could I have? Mr. Fogg's influenced by no one. Has he ever understood that my gratitude to him is overflowing? Has he ever read my heart? My friend, he must not be left alone an instant. You say he's going to speak with me this evening?" "Yes, madam. Probably to arrange for your protection and comfort in England." "We shall see," said Auda, having become suddenly pensive. Throughout the day, Sunday, the house in Savile Row was as if uninhabited, and Phileas Fogg, for the first time since he lived in that house, did not set out for his club when the Westminster clock struck 11:30. Why should he present himself at the Reform? His friends no longer expected him there. As Fogg had not appeared in the saloon on the evening before, Saturday, the 21st of December, at 9:15, he'd lost his wager. It wasn't even necessary that he should go to his bankers for the £20,000. His antagonists had already had his cheque in their hands. They had only to fill it out and send it to the Barings to have the amount transferred to their credit. Fogg, therefore, had no reason for going out, and so he remained at home. He shut himself up in his room and busied himself putting his affairs in order. Passepartout continually ascended and descended the stairs. The hours were long for him. He listened at his master's door and looked through the keyhole as if he had a perfect right to do so, as if he feared that something terrible might happen at any moment. Sometimes he thought of Fix, but no longer in anger. Fix, like all the world, had been mistaken in Phileas Fogg, and had only done his duty in tracking and arresting him, while he, Passepartout. This thought haunted him, and he never ceased cursing his miserable folly. Finding himself too wretched to remain alone, he knocked at Auda's door, went into her room, and seated himself, without speaking, in a corner, and looked ruefully at the young woman. Auda was still pensive. About 7:30 in the evening, Mr. Fogg sent to know if Auda would receive him, and in a few moments he found himself alone with her. Phileas Fogg took down a chair and sat near the fireplace, opposite Auda. No emotion was visible on his face. Fogg returned was exactly the same Fogg who had gone away. There was the same calm, the same impassibility. He sat several minutes without speaking, and then, bending his eyes on Auda, "Madam, will you pardon me for bringing you to England?" Mr. Fogg," replied Auda, checking the pulsations of her heart. "Please, let me finish. When I decided to bring you far away from the country which was so unsafe for you, I was rich, and counted on putting a portion of my fortune at your disposal. Then your existence would have been free and happy. But now I'm ruined." "I know it, Mr. Fogg, and I ask you in my turn, will you forgive me for having followed you, and who knows, for having perhaps delayed you and contributing to your ruin?" "Madam, you could not remain in India, and your safety could only be assured by bringing you to such a distance that your persecutors couldn't take you." "So, Mr. Fogg, not content with rescuing me from a terrible death, you thought yourself bound to secure my comfort in a foreign land?" "Yes, madam, but circumstances have been against me. Still, I beg to place the little I have left at your service." "What will become of you, Mr. Fogg?" "As for me, madam, I have need of nothing." "But how do you look upon the fate, sir, which awaits you?" "As I'm in the habit of doing." "At least one should not overtake a man like you. Your friends—" "I have no friends, madam." "Your relatives—"
"I have no longer any relatives."
"I pity you then, Mr. Fogg. Solitude's a sad thing, with no heart to which to confide your griefs. They say, though, that misery itself, shared by two sympathetic souls, may be borne with patience."
"They do say so, madam."
"Mr. Fogg," said Auda, rising and seizing his hand, "do you wish at once a kinswoman and a friend? Will you have me for your wife?" Fogg, at this, rose in turn. There was an unwonted look in his eyes, and a slight trembling of his lips. Auda looked into his face. The sincerity, rectitude, firmness, and sweetness of the soft glance of a noble woman who could dare all to save him, to whom she owed all, at first astonished, then penetrated him. He shut his eyes for an instant as if to avoid her look, and then when he opened them again, "I love you. Yes, by all that is holiest, I love you, and I'm entirely yours," cried Auda, pressing his hand to her heart. Passepartout was summoned and appeared immediately. Fogg still held out his hand in his own, and Passepartout understood, and his big round face became as radiant as the tropical sun in its zenith. Fogg asked him if it was not too late to notify the Reverend Samuel Wilson of Marylebone Parish that evening. Passepartout smiled his most genial smile and said, "Never too late." It was 5 minutes past 8. "Will it be for tomorrow, Monday?" "For tomorrow, Monday." "Yes, for tomorrow, Monday." And Passepartout hurried off as fast as his legs could carry him. Chapter 36, in which Phileas Fogg's name is once more at a premium on change. It's time to relate what a change took place in English public opinion when it transpired that the real bank robber, a certain James Strand, had been arrested on the 17th day of December at Edinburgh. 3 days before, Phileas Fogg had been a criminal who was desperately being followed up by the police. Now he was an honorable gentleman, mathematically pursuing his eccentric journey around the world. The papers had resumed their discussion about the wager. All those who had laid bets for or against him revived their interest if by magic. The Phileas Fogg bonds again became negotiable, and many new wagers were made. Phileas Fogg's name was once more at a premium on the change. His 5 friends of the Reform Club passed these 3 days in a state of feverish suspense. Would Fogg, whom they had forgotten, reappear before their eyes? Where was he at the moment? The 17th of December, the day of James Strand's arrest, was the 76th since Fogg's departure, and no news of him had been received. Had he died? Had he abandoned the effort, or was he continuing his journey along the route agreed upon? Would he appear on Saturday, the 21st of December, at 9:15 in the evening, on the threshold of the Reform Club saloon? The anxiety in which, for 3 days, London society existed cannot be described. Telegrams were sent to America and Asia for news of Phileas Fogg. Messengers were dispatched to the house in Savile Row, morning and evening. No news. The police were ignorant what had become of the detective Fix, who had so unfortunately followed up a false scent. Bets increased, nevertheless, in number and value. Phileas Fogg, like a racehorse, was drawing near his last turning point. The bonds were quoted, no longer at 100 below par, but at 20, 10, and at 5, and paralytic old Lord Abermale bet even in his favour. A great crowd was collected in Pall Mall and the neighbouring streets on Saturday evening. It seemed like a multitude of brokers permanently established around the Reform Club. Circulation was impeded, and everywhere disputes, discussions, financial transactions they carried on. The police had great difficulty in keeping back the crowd, and as the hour when Phileas Fogg was due approached, the excitement rose to a fever pitch. The 5 antagonists of Fogg had met in the great saloon of the club. John Sullivan and Samuel Fallentin, the bankers, Andrew Stewart, the engineer, Gauthier Ralph, the director of the Bank of England, and Thomas Flanagan, the brewer, one and all, waited anxiously. When the clock indicated 20 minutes past 8, Andrew Stewart got up, saying, "Gentlemen, in 20 minutes the time agreed upon between Mr. Fogg and ourselves will have expired." "What time did the last train arrive from Liverpool?" said Flanagan. "At 23 minutes past 7, replied Ralph, "and the next doesn't arrive until 10 minutes after 12. "Well, gentlemen, if Phileas Fogg had come in the 7:23 train, he would have gotten here by this time. We can therefore regard the bet as won." "Now wait. Don't let us be too hasty. You know that Fogg is very eccentric. His punctuality is well known. He never arrives too soon or too late. I should not be surprised if he appeared before us at the last minute." "Why, if I should see him, I should not believe that it was him." "The fact is," resumed Flanagan, "Fogg's product was absurdly foolish. Whatever his punctuality, he couldn't prevent the delays which were certain to occur. A delay of only 2 or 3 days would be fatal to his tour." "Observe, too," added Sullivan, "we've received no intelligence from him, though there are telegraphic lines all along his route." "He's lost, gentlemen," said Stewart. He's 100 times lost. You know, besides, the China was the only steamer he could have taken from New York to get here in time arrived yesterday. I've seen a list of the passengers, and Phileas Fogg is not among them. Even if we admit that fortune's favoured him, he can scarcely have reached America. I think he'll be at least 20 days behindhand, and Lord Albemarle will lose a cool 5,000. It's clear we have nothing to do but present Mr. Fogg's cheque at Barings tomorrow," replied Ralph. At this moment the hands of the club clock pointed to 20 minutes to 9. 5 minutes more." The gentlemen looked at each other. Their anxiety was becoming intense, but not wishing to betray it, they steadily assented to Mr. Fallentin's proposal of a rubber. "I wouldn't give up my 4,000 of the bet," said Andrew Stewart as he took his seat, "for 3,999. The clock indicated 18 minutes to 9. The players took up their cards, but they couldn't keep their eyes off the clock. Certainly, however secure they felt, minutes had never seemed so long to them. 17 minutes to 9, said Flanagan as he cut the cards which Ralph handed to him. And there was a moment of silence. The great saloon was perfectly quiet. But the murmurs of the crowd outside were heard, with now and then a shrill cry. The pendulum beat the seconds, which each player eagerly counted as he listened with mathematical regularity.
16 minutes to 9,
said Sullivan in a voice which betrayed his emotion. 1 minute more, and the wager would be won. Andrew Stewart and his partners suspended their game. They left their cards and counted the seconds. At the 40th second, nothing. At the 50th, still nothing. At the 55th, a loud cry was heard in the street, followed by applause, hurrahs, and some fierce growls. The players rose from their seats. At the 57th second, the door of the saloon opened, and the pendulum had not yet beat the 60th second when Phileas Fogg appeared, followed by an excited crowd who had forced their way through the club doors, and in his calm voice said, "Here I am, gentlemen." Chapter 37, by which it is shown that Phileas Fogg gained nothing by his tour around the world, unless you count happiness. Yes, that was Phileas Fogg in person. The reader will remember that at 5 minutes past 8 in the evening, about 25 hours after the arrival of the travellers in London, Passepartout had been sent by his master to engage the services of the Reverend Samuel Wilson in a certain marriage ceremony which was to take place the next day. Passepartout went out on his errand, and chanted. He soon reached the clergyman's house, but found him not at home. Passepartout waited a good 20 minutes, and when he left the reverend gentleman, it was 35 minutes past 8. But in what a state he was! With the hair in disorder, and without his hat, he ran along the street as never man was seen to run before, overturning passers-by, rushing over the sidewalk like a waterspout. In 3 minutes he was in Savile Row again, and staggered back into Fogg's room. He couldn't speak. "What's the matter?" "Master, marriage impossible." "Impossible?" "Impossible for tomorrow." "Why so?" Tomorrow is Sunday." "Monday?" "No, today is Saturday." "Saturday? Impossible." Yes. You've made a mistake of one day. We arrived 24 hours ahead of time. There are only 10 minutes left." Passepartout had seized his master by the collar and was dragging him along with irresistible force. Phileas Fogg, thus kidnapped, without having time to think, left his house, jumped into a cab, promised £100 to the cabman, and having run over 2 dogs and overturned 5 carriages, reached the Reform Club. The clock indicated 9:15 when he appeared in the great saloon. Phileas Fogg had accomplished the journey round the world in 80 days. Fogg had won his wager of £20,000. How was it that a man so exact and fastidious could have made this error of a day? How came he to think that he arrived in London on Saturday, the 21st day of December, when it really was Friday, the 20th, the 79th day only from his departure? The cause is incredibly simple. Fogg had, without suspecting it, gained 1 day in his journey, and this merely because he had travelled constantly eastward. He would, on the contrary, have lost a day had he gone in the opposite direction, that is to say, westward. In journeying eastward he had gone towards the sun, and the days therefore diminished for him as many times 4 minutes as he crossed degrees in this direction. There are 360 degrees in the circumference of the earth, and these 360 degrees multiplied by 4 minutes gives precisely 24 hours. That is to say, the day unconsciously gained. In other words, while Phileas Fogg, going eastward, saw the sun pass the meridian 80 times, his friends in London only saw it pass the meridian 79 times. That's why they waited him at the Reform Club on Saturday, and not Sunday, as Mr. Fogg thought. And Passepartout's famous family watch, which had always kept London time, would have betrayed this fact if it had marked the days as well as the hours and minutes. Phileas Fogg, then, had won the £20,000, but he spent nearly 19,000 on the way, so his overall gain was small. His object was, however, to be victorious and not to win money. He divided the £1,000 that remained between Passepartout and the unfortunate Fix, against whom he cherished no grudge. He deducted, however, from Passepartout's share the cost of the gas which had burned in his room for 1,920 hours, for the sake of regularity. That evening, Mr. Fogg, as tranquil and phlegmatic as ever, said to Auda, "Is our marriage still agreeable to you?" "Mr. Fogg, it's for me to ask that question. You were ruined, but you're rich again." "Pardon me, madam, my fortune belongs to you. If you had not suggested our marriage, my servant would not have gone to the Reverend Samuel Wilson's. I should not have been apprised of my error, and dear Mr. Fogg, dear Auda." It need not be said that the marriage took place 48 hours after, and that Passepartout, glowing and dazzling, gave the bride away. Had he not saved her, and was he not entitled to the honour? The next day, as soon as it was light, Passepartout rapped vigorously at his master's door. Fogg opened it and asked, "What's the matter, Passepartout?" "What is it, sir? I have just found this instant, right now found it out." "What?" "That we might have made the tour of the world in only 78 days." "No doubt, by not crossing India. But had I not crossed India, I would not have saved Auda. She would not have been my wife, and—" Fogg at this quietly shut the door. Phileas Fogg had won his wager, and he had made his journey around the world in 80 days. To do this he had employed every means of conveyance: steamers, railways, carriages, yachts, trading vessels, sledges, elephants. The eccentric gentleman had throughout displayed all his marvellous qualities of coolness and exactitude. But what then? What had he really gained by all this trouble? What had he brought back from the long and weary journey? Nothing, say you? Perhaps so. Nothing but a charming woman, who, strange as it may appear, made him the happiest of men. Truly, would you not for less than that make the tour around the world? Okay. That was good. That was really, really good. It also makes me really wish we hadn't taken 4 weeks on it, but I was dozing off during that one recording, and I didn't want to do this book dirty by not reading it proper. We got like 3 minutes left to make this a 2-hour recording, and I don't want to just sit here and wheedle for 3 minutes. Well, I mean, I do have some short stories I could do, but I also don't want to go over time, you know? We're just going to call it good at where we're at here. So, I'm going to give him a spiel for what I do around here. If you're new around here, if you've dropped by and I've not noticed you dropping into the chat, my name is Glacier Nestor. Whether there's an underscore in there or not really depends on whether the website lets me put an underscore in there. I do this Friday nights. What's this? It's called Paper Cuts, as the title implies. I read a public domain book until I finish it. It's a great time, and it's my flagship show, and I'm very proud of it. I think it's kind of obvious that it really started out as a radio show, but it's still one of my favorite things I do around here, and I love it to death. And I'll probably never run out of books. Like, there's 20,000 plus books in Project Gutenberg off the top of my head. So, like, and if I ever wind up being able to get a blanket license to, like, be able to have performance rights to non-public domain books, then I have literally 99% of literature, depending on the publisher I get a blanket license from. But anyway, that's this. If you've been listening to this, you probably know that already, because we're on the 4th episode of Around the World in 80 Days. But what you might not know, because you might not have stuck around, is I also do a variety game stream on Twitch at Wednesday evenings. Right now we're playing Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages, and we're getting real close to the end of that game. And I have a couple really, really neat games lined up for Wednesday nights after we're done with Zelda. Eventually, we'll work our way back around to Oracle of Seasons, but I might play that on my own first. Although if I'm going to play it on my own, I might not even play it on stream. But, like, I don't know. I'll cross that bridge when we're a little closer. It's a long ways off. Anyway, then I also have a YouTube. That's one of the places where it's a space instead of an underscore. I do an original piece of content every Monday. Most of the time, it's a first impression series called Frozen Tundra Finds. I do a season of 15 games where I pick 15 games that I want to show you all, and then at the end of the season, I pick one game. I low-key want you to invest in a PS4 and play Detroit. Oh, don't tempt me. Oh, I want to play Detroit so bad. You know I'm the biggest sucker for robots. I'd have to do Detroit as a Wednesday night stream. There's no way I could do it as a Frozen Tundra Finds game, because like the thing with Frozen Tundra Finds is I play 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, and then I can't touch the game unless you guys vote on it, or another thing happens that's going to happen eventually that I won't spoil. But essentially, I play 15 games. I pick one and say, all right, I'm going to play this until it's done. While I'm playing this game, you all vote from the remaining 14 games and pick what you guys want to see. Right now, we're in the process of playing the game that you guys picked, which was Mario All-Stars, which has led to a lot of me failing really, really badly at Mario 3. But you know what? We have some serious, deep conversations about legality of emulation and games as art and stuff. It's a fun time. Also, there's some good goofs in there, I promise. They're mostly visual goofs, because 90% of the time I'm on an auditory tangent about a thing. But that doesn't shock you if you're not new around here. Anyway, between here and YouTube and the Dungeons & Dragons game I'm in, I have content all days but one day of the week. Well, provided the Dungeons & Dragons is still being streamed. Right now, the one day of the week that's missing is Tuesday. It used to be that it was Sunday because of the Dungeons & Dragons, but now Dungeons & Dragons is on Sunday, so we have Tuesday. I'm currently working on getting those Dungeons & Dragons videos uploaded. They're going to be the only videos on this Twitch channel. Or I might actually just hand the finished products to the guy who streams them, who's a real nice dude, by the way, and tell him to upload them, because it's drop dead simple, and you go to a streamer cafe anyway and you have good bandwidth. Just do it, please. But we'll see. That's a lot of administrative gobbledygook. While I blither for a little bit, I'm going to open Twitch, and we're going to see if we have anybody to raid right now. Oh, we got plenty of people to raid. The guy I just mentioned, Matt Hatter Plays, he's playing League. I like you, Matt. I don't want to watch you play League. League is not my zone. We got somebody playing Sploon. Ooh, we got Half Coordinated playing Monster Hunter. That's kind of interesting. Yo, someone's doing game development. I'm very tempted to drop you guys on that guy. Someone's playing the new Spoderman. Pro Jared's playing Final Fantasy Tactics. Someone's playing Infamous Second Son with one viewer. Oh, that's not in English. Never mind. I lied. Hi, I would like to... Okay, I think... See, now I'm... Okay. This is why I have coins right next to me while I stream. Alright, so if we get heads, we're gonna go raid Matt. If we get tails, we're gonna go raid the game dev guy, okay? Okay, ready? We got heads. We're gonna go raid Matt. I'm not kidding you. We got heads. I didn't use my... Hang on, I gotta flip this until I get tails, just for balance's sake. Oh, cool. I dropped it. It's gone forever now. Hang on. There we go, tails. Anyway, so we're gonna go raid Matt. That's it for this evening. If you're sticking around for the recording, I'm really glad that you stuck around. Feel free to go check out some of those videos I mentioned while I was spieling about my stuff. And I hope you have a great week.